She is basically a ghost. At this point, I do not even know why they keep her around. The words floated across the nurses' station at Mercy General Hospital, carried by the kind of whisper that was meant to be heard. Claire Hartley did not look up from her paperwork, did not flinch, did not give any indication that the comment had landed exactly where it was intended. She had perfected that particular skill over the past 22 years, the art of absorbing cruelty without letting it show on her face. It was 2:45 in the morning on a rainy Tuesday in downtown Chicago, and the fluorescent lights overhead hummed with that headache-inducing buzz that Claire had stopped consciously noticing about 2 decades ago. The sound had become part of her, woven into the fabric of her existence, like the smell of antiseptic and floor wax that permanently clung to her skin. At 54 years old, Claire Hartley was the kind of nurse who held the trauma department together, though you would never know it by looking at her personnel file or listening to the young staff members who gathered at the coffee machine to gossip about her. She sat hunched over her charts, blonde hair pulled back into a severe and sensible bun that made her look older than she actually was. She wore no makeup, and her reading glasses were perched on the tip of her nose in a way that the younger nurses found almost comically outdated. Her oversized scrubs hung loose on her frame, deliberately chosen to hide any hint of the figure beneath, to make her as unremarkable and forgettable as possible. To anyone passing by, she was invisible, a piece of hospital furniture that had been there so long nobody remembered when it arrived. The young nurses at the other end of the station continued their conversation, apparently convinced that Claire was either deaf or simply too insignificant to matter. They called her the grandmother behind her back, not out of affection, but out of pity, the kind of condescending sympathy reserved for elderly relatives who have overstayed their welcome at family gatherings. They thought she was slow, outdated, a relic clinging to a job that had long since passed her by. They whispered about how she should have retired years ago, how she moved too carefully through the trauma bay, how she probably could not handle a real emergency anymore. They were wrong about everything, but Claire had learned long ago that the best armor was invisibility. What nobody noticed, what nobody ever noticed, was that Claire Hartley was always watching. When a supply car crashed in the hallway 2 hours ago, sending metal instruments clattering across the linoleum floor, every other nurse in the vicinity had jumped at the sudden noise. Claire had not flinched. Instead, her eyes had snapped immediately to the exits, counting the escape routes with a precision that came from somewhere deep in her muscle memory. Her hand had moved instinctively to her hip, reaching for something that had not been there in 20 years. By the time anyone might have noticed, she had caught herself and resumed her paperwork as if nothing had happened. There was a scar on her forearm, a jagged line of tissue that ran from her wrist to just below her elbow, and she kept it hidden beneath her watch strap and the long sleeves she wore regardless of the season. Sometimes when she reached for a chart or stretched to grab a supply from a high shelf, a glimpse of that scar would peek out, but nobody was ever paying enough attention to Claire Hartley to notice something like that. Tonight, beneath her scrub coat, she was wearing a red dress. It sounds absurd, and Claire felt absurd every time she thought about it, but there was a reason for the elegant fabric pressed against her skin underneath the shapeless hospital uniform. She had planned a date tonight, her first real date in 3 years since her husband Michael had lost his battle with pancreatic cancer. A colleague from the oncology department had asked her to dinner, a kind widower named Robert, who understood loss and did not expect her to be anything other than what she was. She had spent an hour that afternoon choosing the dress, a fitted red number that she had not worn since before Michael got sick. Something that made her feel like a woman instead of a ghost. But then the emergency call had come in, and Claire had stayed, because that is what Claire always did, and she had texted Robert an apology that he had graciously accepted, and now it was nearly 3 in the morning, and the red dress felt like a cruel joke against her exhausted body. A middle-aged woman playing dress-up, she thought bitterly. Who was she kidding? She finished her paperwork and signed the last chart with a hand that was steadier than it had any right to be after 14 hours on her feet. 22 years she had given to this hospital. 22 years of missed birthdays and canceled plans and overtime shifts that had stolen the final months of her husband's life. 22 years of being the one who held the hands of dying patients when their families could not make it in time, of cleaning up the messes that the residents left behind, of training young nurses who would eventually stand at coffee machines and call her a ghost. Tonight, Mercy General Hospital would give her nothing in return. 2 hours earlier, before the gossip and the exhaustion and the growing certainty that something terrible was about to happen, Claire had been doing what she did best, which was saving a life that nobody else thought was worth saving. The emergency admission had come in just after midnight. A homeless man in his late 50s who had been found collapsed near the ambulance bay by a paramedic taking a cigarette break. He had no identification on him, no wallet, no insurance card, nothing that would tell the hospital administration that he was worth the considerable expense of keeping him alive. He was delirious with fever, his body shaking with the unmistakable tremors of septic shock, and by the time they got him onto a gurney and wheeled him into the trauma bay, his organs were already beginning to shut down. Claire had recognized the signs immediately, the way his skin had taken on that particular grayish hue, the rapid shallow breathing, the blood pressure numbers that kept dropping despite the saline they were pumping into his veins. She had seen sepsis kill too many patients to count, and she knew with absolute certainty that this man had maybe 30 minutes before his body gave up entirely. The infection was overwhelming his system, and without aggressive intervention, he would be dead before sunrise. The problem was the medicine he needed. Dr. Lisa Chen, the young attending physician who was the only colleague Claire genuinely respected, stood at the bedside with her tablet and a conflicted expression on her face. The antibiotics that would save this man's life were sitting in a locked cabinet on the other side of the trauma bay, and those particular antibiotics were classified as restricted medication reserved for patients with verified insurance coverage or active military personnel whose treatment would be reimbursed by the government. Hospital policy handed down from the administration office on the third floor was absolutely clear on this matter. "I can put in a request for emergency authorization," Lisa said, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who already knew the answer. "But it is the middle of the night and the review board will not convene until morning, and by then," she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Claire looked at the man on the gurney. He was somebody's son, she thought. Maybe somebody's father. He had lived a life that had somehow led him to this moment, to dying alone in a hospital that was debating whether his existence was cost-effective. The machines around him beeped their warnings, counting down the minutes he had left. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats. Without saying a word to Lisa, without documenting her actions in the chart, without following any of the protocols that had been drilled into her for 22 years. Claire walked to the restricted cabinet and punched in the override code that she had memorized during a security training session she was never supposed to attend. The lock clicked open. She grabbed the medication, the expensive life-saving antibiotics that were worth more than her monthly salary, and she walked back to the gurney and prepared the injection. Claire Lisa whispered, her eyes wide with something between admiration and fear. "If they find out, then they find out," Claire said quietly, and she slid the needle into the IV port and pushed the plunger. What happened next would haunt her for weeks. As the medication entered his bloodstream, the homeless man's eyes suddenly flew open. For a moment, just a single moment, the delirium cleared, and he looked at Claire with a lucidity that seemed impossible given his condition. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with the strength that made her gasp, a grip that felt nothing like the frail touch of a dying man. He pulled her close, close enough that she could smell the sickness on his breath, close enough that she could see something ancient and knowing in his gray eyes. "White witch." He whispered the words barely audible above the beeping of the machines. "Safe now." His hand squeezed hers with desperate intensity, and Claire felt something small and hard pressed into her palm. She was too focused on his vital signs, too concerned with monitoring his response to the medication, to pay attention to whatever he had given her. Her training took over her hands, automatically checking his pulse, while her eyes watched the monitors for any sign of improvement. She tucked the small object into her inner scrub pocket, the one she never used, the one that was meant to hold a pager she had not carried in years. The man's grip loosened. His eyes fluttered closed. The sedation finally took hold, and his vital signs began to stabilize as the antibiotics started their work. Claire had saved his life. She had broken hospital policy, risked her career, and committed what the administration would certainly call theft, but the man on the gurney was going to live. That was what mattered. That was always what mattered. She had no idea that she had just saved something far more important than a single life. The fluorescent lights in the break room seemed harsher than usual, casting everything in a sickly pale glow that made Claire feel like a specimen under a microscope. She had come here to rest for a few minutes before finishing her shift, to maybe close her eyes and let the exhaustion wash over her in waves, but the door had opened and closed behind her, and now she was trapped. Bradley Whitmore stood in front of the only exit, his perfectly tailored suit, a stark contrast to the worn vinyl furniture and coffee-stained countertops that surrounded them. At 34 years old, he was the hospital's newly appointed chief of administration, a man who had climbed the corporate ladder with remarkable speed, and absolutely zero patient contact. His suit cost more than Claire's car. His manicured nails had never been stained with blood. His hands, soft and uncalloused, had never held the hand of a dying stranger at 3 in the morning. He was blocking the door on purpose, Claire realized. It was a power play, a way of making her feel cornered before he even opened his mouth. "I do not care about the Hippocratic Oath right now," Claire Whitmore said, his voice carrying that particular tone of exaggerated patience that people use when they are about to deliver very bad news. "I care about the budget variance report." He was tapping a tablet with his manicured finger, the screen glowing with numbers and charts that probably represented human lives as line items on a spreadsheet. Claire sat on the vinyl couch across from him, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, her body aching from 14 hours of trauma care. But it was not the physical fatigue that made her hands tremble. It was this confrontation, this sterile corporate assault that she had somehow always known was coming. "Mr. Whitmore," Claire said, her voice raspy from overuse, "the patient, Mr. Henderson, was going into septic shock. He is homeless. He did not have insurance information on him. If I had not opened that cabinet and administered those antibiotics, he would be dead right now. Not in an hour. Not after a committee review. Now." Whitmore sighed, a sound of theatrical exasperation that he had probably practiced in front of a mirror. "And because you bypassed authorization to access restricted high-cost medication for a John Doe, you have flagged us for an audit." He looked up from his tablet, his eyes cold and calculating. "Do you have any idea how much that medication costs per dose? It is reserved for critical insured cases or active military personnel whose treatment is guaranteed reimbursement. We cannot simply hand it out to every vagrant who collapses on our doorstep. He is a human being." The words came out sharper than Claire intended, a rare flash of anger breaking through her carefully constructed armor of invisibility. "And for what it is worth, he is a veteran." He mumbled it when he was delirious. Whitmore's smile was thin and cruel. "They all say they are veterans, Claire. It gets them sympathy from soft-hearted nurses who do not understand how hospitals actually function." He checked his watch, a gesture clearly designed to remind her that her time was less valuable than his. "Look, this is not the first incident in your file. You have a pattern of prioritizing emotion over protocol, of making unilateral decisions that cost this institution money. Mercy General is a business, not a charity. We cannot sustain bleeding hearts in positions of responsibility." He looked up from his tablet, and something in his expression shifted, becoming harder and more final. "Pack your locker," Whitmore said. "You are suspended, effective immediately, pending a formal review board hearing on Monday morning. But between us, I would start looking for positions at nursing homes or hospice facilities. Something more suited to your particular approach to medicine." He paused, letting the words sink in like poison. "You are done here." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Claire had ever felt in 22 years of working in trauma. She felt a stinging sensation behind her eyes, the threat of tears that she absolutely refused to let fall in front of this man. She had seen things that Bradley Whitmore could not imagine in his worst nightmares. She had held soldiers together with her bare hands while helicopters screamed overhead. She had ordered dying boys to live and watched them obey her command. She would not cry in front of a corporate administrator in a designer suit. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that she refused to let become an admission of defeat. She stood up, her joints protesting after 14 hours on her feet, and she brushed past him toward the door. "Hand in your badge at security," Whitmore called after her, his voice carrying that particular smugness of a man who knows he has won. On the way out, Claire did not respond. She walked out of the break room and into the harsh fluorescent corridor, and she did not look back. The hallway stretched before her like a gauntlet, and Claire Hartley walked it with her head held high, even as her world collapsed around her. News travels fast in hospitals, faster than viruses, faster than emergency codes, faster than the speed of human compassion. By the time Claire had made it 50 feet from the break room, she could tell from the way people were suddenly finding their charts incredibly interesting that everyone already knew. The nurse's station fell silent as she approached. A resident she had trained last year pretended to take an important phone call. Two nurses she had mentored through their first code blues stepped into a supply closet as if they had urgent business there. Nobody wanted to be associated with the woman who had just been fired. 22 years, Claire thought as she walked. 22 years of arriving early and staying late. 22 years of covering shifts for colleagues with sick children and family emergencies. 22 years of institutional knowledge of knowing exactly where every supply was kept, of remembering the allergies and preferences of patients who returned year after year. All of it erased in a single conversation with a man who had never held a dying person's hand. Only one person met her eyes as she walked that terrible corridor. Dr. Lisa Chen stood near the medication station, her expression a mixture of grief and helpless anger. She did not say anything, could not say anything that would make a difference, but she mouthed the words, "I am sorry," and gave Claire a small nod of solidarity. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for her all night, and Claire felt her throat tighten with an emotion she could not afford to indulge. The locker room was mercifully empty. Claire stood in front of her locker, the same one she had used for more than 2 decades, and slowly spun the combination dial for what she knew would be the last time. The metal door swung open to reveal the artifacts of her professional life, the accumulated possessions of a career that was ending not with celebration, but with humiliation. She reached for her stethoscope first, an old model with worn tubing that she had refused to replace despite the availability of newer technology. It had been a gift from her father, a Navy corpsman who had served in Vietnam and who had cried with pride the day she graduated from nursing school. He had been gone for 15 years now, but every time she placed those earpieces in her ears and listened to a patient's heartbeat, she felt like he was standing beside her. She placed the stethoscope in her tote bag with trembling hands. Next was the photograph of Emma, her daughter taken at her college graduation 3 years ago. Emma was in California now, building a career in environmental law, calling every Sunday without fail, but visiting less and less frequently as her life grew fuller and more demanding. Claire understood. She had missed so many of Emma's childhood moments, for this job had been absent for school plays and soccer games and birthday parties because Mercy General always needed her more. The irony of being discarded by the institution she had sacrificed her family for was not lost on her. The photograph went into the bag beside the stethoscope. Finally, she unclipped her ID badge from her scrub top and held it in her palm. The plastic rectangle stared back at her with her own face younger and more hopeful, captured on a day when she had believed that doing good work would be enough to protect her. The words printed below her photograph felt like an epitaph: Claire Hartley, RN Senior Trauma Nurse. She placed the badge on the bench. She could not bring herself to hand it to security like some common criminal being processed out of the system. She put on her coat over the red dress she was still wearing underneath her scrubs, the elegant fabric that now felt like a cosmic joke. A middle-aged woman, who had thought she might have one evening of feeling beautiful and desirable and alive, reduced to walking out of the building where she had spent most of her adult life. The dress felt ridiculous against her skin, a reminder of hope that had been crushed along with everything else. Claire walked toward the main lobby, her tote bag clutched against her chest like a shield. Through the windows, she could see the Chicago rain hammering against the glass, turning the city into a blur of gray and neon that seemed to reflect her own internal state. Her car was in the parking garage 3 levels down, waiting to carry her home to an empty apartment where nobody would be expecting her. 22 years, and she was leaving with a tote bag and a broken heart. Arthur, the night security guard, was the only one at the front desk who looked at her with anything resembling kindness. He was 68 years old, had worked at Mercy General almost as long as Claire had, and he had always treated her with the quiet respect that came from recognizing a fellow survivor of institutional indifference. "Rough night, Claire," he asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "You could say that, Arthur." Her voice came out as a whisper, and she hated how small it sounded. "Well, you take care of yourself, okay? Whatever happened, you are still one of the good ones. Do not let anyone tell you different." Claire managed a weak smile that did not reach her eyes. "Thank you, Arthur. You take care too." She was 3 steps from the exit, 3 steps from walking out into the rain and beginning the rest of her suddenly empty life, when Arthur stopped mid-sentence. "What in the world?" he muttered, staring past her toward the darkness beyond the glass doors. Claire turned around. Through the rain-slicked windows, she could see lights cutting through the storm. Not ambulance lights, not the familiar red and white strobes that she had seen thousands of times. These were different, piercing, high-intensity beams that seemed to slice through the rain like knives through flesh. 3 massive black SUVs, completely unmarked, screeched to a halt in the ambulance bay, blocking the entrance with military precision. Claire's hand moved instinctively to her hip, reaching for something that had not been there in 20 years. Her heart rate spiked, and somewhere deep in her memory, doors that she had welded shut began to rattle on their hinges. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. The doors of the SUVs flew open in perfect synchronization, a choreographed movement that spoke of thousands of hours of training and an absolute commitment to precision. Claire watched through the rain-streaked glass as six figures emerged into the storm, and something cold and ancient stirred in her chest. These men did not run. They stalked. They moved through the rain like predators crossing open ground, their bodies flowing with a fluid efficiency that Claire recognized on a cellular level, even though she could not consciously explain why. They were dressed in full tactical gear, heavy ballistic vests over black combat uniforms, pistols holstered on their thighs, boots that looked like they had crossed deserts and mountains in the worst places on Earth. They were not police. They were not SWAT. They carried themselves with a different weight entirely, a darkness that came from doing things that governments would never officially acknowledge. They were operators, the kind of men who did not exist on paper. The automatic doors of the ER hissed open, and the storm blew in with them, cold and wet and violent. But the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop for a reason that had nothing to do with the weather. Claire pressed herself against the wall near the exit, clutching her tote bag like a shield, trying to make herself as small and invisible as she had spent 22 years learning to be. The six men entered the lobby in formation, water dripping from their tactical vests onto the polished linoleum floor. They were terrifying in their silence, in their absolute control, in the way they seemed to fill the space with a presence that made the walls feel closer. The sheer size of them made the hospital lobby feel like a closet. The leader was a giant of a man, easily 6.5 feet tall, with a thick beard that was soaked with rain and a jagged scar that ran through his left eyebrow. His eyes swept the room like targeting lasers, cataloging every exit and every potential threat, with a speed that spoke of a lifetime spent in environments where missing a detail meant death. The hospital went dead quiet. A patient in the waiting area dropped his magazine. A nurse at the triage desk froze with her phone halfway to her ear. Even the monitors seemed to lower their beeping, as if the machines themselves understood that something extraordinary was happening. Bradley Whitmore came running from the administrative corridor, his expensive shoes clicking frantically against the floor, his face a mixture of outrage and confusion. He saw the wet floor, the tracked-in mud, the weapons visible on the men's thighs, and his administrative mind apparently decided that this was a situation that required his immediate intervention. "Excuse me?" Whitmore shouted, his voice cracking with the effort of projecting authority he clearly did not feel. "Excuse me, you cannot bring weapons into this facility. This is a sterile environment. I am the chief of administration for this hospital, and I demand to know who is in charge of this operation." The man with the beard did not even look at him. He walked right past Whitmore, as if the administrator were nothing more than a ghost, an inconvenient obstacle between himself and wherever he was actually going. The other 5 men fanned out behind him, taking positions around the lobby in what Claire recognized immediately as a military defensive perimeter. They were not here to cause chaos. They were here to secure the area. Whitmore, his face flushing red with the humiliation of being ignored, made the mistake of reaching out to grab the leader's arm. "I am talking to you," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "Get out of my hospital immediately or I will call the..." The soldier stopped. He turned his head slowly, a movement that seemed to take forever, and looked down at the hand gripping his arm. Then he raised his eyes to meet Whitmore's, and something in that gaze made the administrator release his grip immediately. "Sir?" The soldier's voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was something beneath it that promised violence. "Step aside, or be removed." Whitmore physically recoiled, stumbling backward over his own feet, his expensive shoes sliding on the wet floor. He caught himself on the edge of the reception desk and stood there speechless for perhaps the first time in his career. The soldier turned back to the room. He was not looking for a doctor. He was not looking for the emergency department. His eyes were scanning the faces around him with an intensity that made Claire's heart pound against her ribs. Then his gaze locked onto her. She was standing near the exit, her back pressed against the wall, her tote bag clutched to her chest. She felt small. She felt terrified. She felt like the ground was about to open up beneath her feet. The giant soldier started walking toward her. The heavy thud of combat boots against linoleum echoed through the silent lobby like a countdown to something Claire could not comprehend. Thud, thud, thud. Each step brought the giant soldier closer, and each step made Claire's heart beat faster. She wanted to run, but her legs had apparently decided to stop taking orders from her brain. She pressed herself harder against the wall, as if she might somehow phase through the solid surface and escape into the rainy night. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps, and her mind was racing through every possible explanation for what was happening. Had she done something wrong? Was this about the unauthorized medication? Had Whitmore somehow called federal authorities about the antibiotic theft? The soldier stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close, he was even more intimidating than he had appeared from across the lobby. He smelled of rain and gun oil and something that might have been old tobacco, a combination that triggered memories Claire had spent 2 decades trying to suppress. He towered over her, blocking out the fluorescent lights, casting her in shadow. Claire looked up, trembling. I do not understand. The soldier reached up his hand, massive inside its tactical glove, and Claire flinched instinctively. Arthur, the security guard, reached for his radio, clearly thinking that Claire was about to be attacked. But the soldier did not strike. He reached up to his own face and removed his ballistic sunglasses. His eyes were a piercing blue, the kind of blue that Claire had seen only once before in her life, in circumstances that she had buried so deep in her memory that she had almost convinced herself they were a dream. And as he looked down at her, the hardness in those blue eyes began to melt away, replaced by something that looked painfully, impossibly like adoration. "Ma'am." His voice was deep and gravelly, but he spoke loudly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear him clearly. The word hung in the air, laden with meaning that only Claire could begin to understand. And then, the impossible happened. The giant soldier snapped his heels together with a sharp crack that echoed off the walls. His spine straightened to perfect military attention. His right hand came up in a crisp, razor-sharp salute, the kind of salute that soldiers reserve for generals and presidents, and the highest honors of their profession. "Ma'am," he repeated, his voice carrying across the frozen lobby, "Team Bravo is present and accounted for." Behind him, all 5 of the other operators snapped to attention in perfect unison. 5 hands rose in 5 identical salutes, directed not at any flag or commanding officer, but at a 54-year-old trauma nurse in a rumpled coat holding a tote bag containing a stethoscope and a photograph of her daughter. The silence in the lobby of Mercy General Hospital was absolute. It was the kind of silence usually reserved for cathedrals or the aftermath of explosions, a vacuum where normal reality had simply ceased to exist. Bradley Whitmore stood with his mouth hanging open, looking like a fish gasping for air on the deck of a boat. The triage nurses had climbed onto their desks to get a better view of whatever was happening. Arthur had lowered his radio and was staring at the scene with an expression of complete bewilderment. Claire stared at the man saluting her, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She looked at his face, really looked at him, taking in the details she had been too frightened to notice before. The blue eyes that seemed somehow familiar. The jagged scar through his eyebrow. The way he held his jaw set with determination, but softened by emotion. A memory slashed through her confusion, sharp and violent and absolutely real. Dust everywhere, getting into her eyes and mouth and lungs. The smell of burning diesel and blood and fear. A helicopter rotor screaming overhead, struggling to hold position in a sandstorm. A young man on a stretcher, barely 20 years old, his throat torn open by shrapnel, drowning in his own blood. His eyes had been blue, terrified blue, looking up at her, as if she were the only thing standing between him and death. Claire's tote bag slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. "Ethan?" She whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ethan Cole. The soldier commander. Ethan Reaper." Cole broke his salute. A slow, tired smile spread across his rugged face, transforming him for just a moment from a terrifying warrior into the scared young man she had saved 2 decades ago. The smile made him look 10 years younger, and Claire felt tears welling in her eyes before she could stop them. "Hello, Claire," he said softly, his voice thick with 20 years of searching. "I told you I would find you. It took the Navy 15 years to declassify the mission logs, and it took me another 5 to track you down through all the name changes. But I told you I would find you. You were dead." The words came out as a sob that Claire could not control. Tears were streaming down her face now, and she did not care who saw them. "You flatlined on the helicopter. I watched the monitors. I watched you die." Ethan's smile widened, though there was a sadness in it that spoke of all the years they had lost. "I am hard to kill," he said. He gestured to the 5 men still standing at attention behind him. "We all are. Thanks to you." Ethan Cole turned away from Claire, though his hand remained extended toward her, as if he could not bear to completely break the contact. He scanned the room, and when his eyes landed on Bradley Whitmore still cowering near the reception desk, His expression shifted from tender reunion to something far more dangerous. Is this woman Ethan, said his voice returning to that commanding pitch that could carry across a battlefield, being processed for discharge from this facility? Whitmore, apparently too arrogant and too slow to recognize when the power dynamic in a room had fundamentally shifted, straightened his tie, and stepped forward. He had recovered some of his composure, though his hands were still trembling slightly at his sides. She is being terminated for gross misconduct, Whitmore announced, trying to inject authority into his voice. She stole hospital property, expensive medication that was reserved for authorized patients. I do not care who you are or what kind of dramatic entrance you think you are making. This is a private personnel matter, and you are trespassing on hospital grounds. Ethan turned to face Whitmore fully. The smile that had softened his features when he looked at Claire was completely gone now. What remained was the predator, the man who had spent 2 decades hunting enemies of his country through the worst terrain on Earth. Terminated? Ethan repeated, saying the word as if it tasted like poison in his mouth. Yes, Whitmore said, apparently mistaking Ethan's quiet tone for submission. Fired. She is a liability the hospital cannot. Ethan laughed. It was a cold, dry sound that cut Whitmore off mid-sentence, a laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. He turned to look at the 5 soldiers still standing at attention behind him. Boys, Ethan said, did you hear that the suit thinks the White Witch is a liability? The other 5 SEALs chuckled, and the sound of their laughter was menacing in a way that made several of the observers in the lobby take unconscious steps backward. These were not men who laughed at jokes. These were men who laughed before doing terrible things to people who deserved terrible things. Whitmore's face had gone pale. The White Witch. Her name is Claire. I do not know what you are. That is what you call her. Ethan said, stepping into Whitmore's personal space until the administrator was forced to crane his neck upward to meet the soldier's eyes. In the Hindu Kush in the Korangal Valley and places you do not even know exist, we called her the White Witch because only magic could explain how she brought men back from the dead the way she did. Ethan turned back to Claire. His expression softened when he saw her trembling hands, her tear-streaked face, the cheap tote bag containing everything she had left of her 22-year career lying on the floor at her feet. Claire, he said, his voice gentle now. We did not just come here to say hello. We came because we owe a debt. A life debt. My life and the lives of every man on that mission who made it home because of what you did. Claire was shaking her head, trying to make sense of a reality that had completely overturned itself in the past 5 minutes. Ethan? I was just doing my job. I was just a volunteer nurse with the Red Cross. I was not even supposed to be in that sector when the attack happened. That is exactly the point, Ethan said. You were not supposed to be there. But when the ambush happened, when my team was pinned down and bleeding out, you did not run. You came for us. You saved us, and tonight we are here to return the favor. He looked at his watch, then back at Claire with an expression that told her the reunion was only part of the reason for his arrival. We have a transport waiting, Ethan said, but we are not leaving until we settle this disrespect. He turned to face Whitmore, who had backed up until he was pressed against the reception desk with nowhere left to retreat. You said she stole hospital property. How much? The medication. Whitmore stammered, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Maybe $2,000 when you include the potential fines and audit costs. But the principle of the matter. Ethan reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a thick wad of cash $100 bills held together with a rubber band that identified it as mission contingency funds. Without breaking eye contact with Whitmore, he threw the entire stack at the administrator's chest. The bills hit Whitmore square in the sternum and then fluttered to the floor around him like heavy confetti scattering across the polished linoleum. There was easily $15,000 lying at the administrator's feet. Keep the change, Ethan said. Buy yourself a soul. He turned back to Claire, extending his hand toward her. Grab your bag, we have somewhere to be. A meeting with who? Claire asked, still struggling to process everything that was happening. Ethan, I do not have anywhere to go. I just lost my job. I need to figure out how to pay my rent, You do not need this job, Ethan said firmly. And the meeting is not a who, it is a them. But first, we need to get you out of here. Before Claire could respond, Ethan turned to the security desk where Arthur was still standing watching the scene with wide eyes and an expression of profound wonder. "You are Arthur, right?" Ethan asked. Arthur nodded too, surprised to speak. "You were the only person in this building who looked at her with respect when we walked in," Ethan said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy coin, a challenge coin embossed with a golden trident that marked it as something sacred to the SEAL community. He pressed it into Arthur's weathered hand. "If you ever need anything," Ethan said, "anything at all, you call the number engraved on the back of that coin. Day or night. Someone will answer." Arthur looked down at the coin in his palm, then back up at Claire. His eyes were glistening with emotion. "Go on, Claire. I think you are in good hands." Claire looked at Ethan, then at Whitmore, who had dropped to his knees and was scrambling to collect the cash scattered around him, with the desperate movements of a man who had just realized how thoroughly he had been defeated. She looked at the hospital that had drained her for 22 years, at the colleagues who had avoided her eyes during her walk of shame, at the walls that had witnessed 2 decades of her sacrifice and had offered nothing in return. She bent down and picked up her tote bag. "Okay," she whispered. "Form up!" Ethan barked, and the 5 SEALs instantly moved to surround Claire in a diamond formation, the same protective arrangement used for presidents and visiting dignitaries. Claire found herself in the center, shielded on all sides by the most lethal men she had ever encountered. Moving, Ethan called out. They marched her out of the hospital through the automatic doors and into the rain toward the black SUVs that were still idling in the ambulance bay, with their headlights cutting through the storm. As the cold Chicago rain hit her face, Claire felt something shift inside her chest. The humiliation of the past hour was washing away, replaced by something she could not quite name. The red dress under her coat did not feel ridiculous anymore. It felt like armor. She had no idea what was coming next. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Claire Hartley was not invisible anymore. The interior of the black SUV smelled like leather and gun oil, and the particular metallic scent of men who had recently been in combat. Claire sat in the back seat, squeezed between Ethan and another massive operator, whose call sign she would later learn was Bear. The rain hammered against the tinted windows, turning the Chicago streetlights into smeared watercolors as the vehicle accelerated through the empty streets. Claire's hands were still trembling in her lap, and she could not seem to make them stop. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation in the hospital lobby was beginning to fade, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. 20 years of carefully constructed walls were crumbling inside her mind, and memories she had spent 2 decades burying were clawing their way back to the surface. The rain on the window became something else. The streaks of water transformed into streaks of sand blown by helicopter rotors. The hum of the SUV's engine became the scream of turbines struggling against a desert wind. The smell of leather seats became the smell of blood and burning diesel and fear. "You remember, do you not?" Ethan's voice cut through her dissociation, gentle but knowing. He was watching her face with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly what was happening inside her head. Claire blinked, forcing herself back to the present. The Chicago rain reasserted itself against the windows. The SUV was real. She was safe. "I remember everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the wipers. "I spent 20 years trying to forget, but I remember every single moment of that night." She closed her eyes and the past reached up to claim her. 20 years earlier, Claire Hartley had been a different woman entirely. At 34 years old, she had been a volunteer nurse with Doctors Without Borders stationed at a small medical clinic in Kandahar province, Afghanistan. The clinic was supposed to be in a green zone, a protected area where international aid workers could provide medical care to local civilians without becoming targets in a war that had already consumed too many innocent lives. Claire had believed in that mission with the kind of fierce idealism that only comes from not yet understanding how the world actually works. She had volunteered because her daughter Emma had just started college, and the empty nest had left her feeling purposeless and small. Her marriage to Michael was strong but quiet, the comfortable silence of 2 people who had been together long enough to run out of new things to say. She had wanted adventure. She had wanted to feel like she was making a difference in a world that seemed increasingly dark and complicated. The clinic had been everything she had hoped for, and nothing like she had expected. It was understaffed and undersupplied, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of human suffering that passed through its doors every single day. Children with infections that would have been trivial to treat in America. Mothers who had walked for days to get antibiotics for their babies. Old men with war wounds that had never properly healed their bodies, carrying the shrapnel of conflicts that had been raging since before Claire was born. She had loved every exhausting, heartbreaking moment of it. The other aid workers had warned her about getting too attached, about maintaining professional distance from the patients whose lives she was trying to save. But Claire had never been good at professional distance. She learned the names of the children who came through the clinic. She held the hands of dying men and women who had no family left to comfort them. She stayed late and arrived early and gave pieces of herself to strangers who would never know how much she cared. She had been naive, she would later realize. She had thought that kindness and bandages could somehow heal a country that had been at war for generations. She had thought that being in a green zone meant being safe. She had no idea that everything she believed about the world was about to be shattered. Claire was sterilizing surgical instruments in the small tent that served as the clinic's supply room when the explosion happened. It was not the distant thump of mortar fire that she had grown accustomed to over the past few months, the background percussion of a war being fought somewhere else. This was different. This was close. This was the kind of explosion that you felt in your teeth and your bones, a shock wave that lifted her off her feet and threw her against a rack of metal trays that clattered to the ground around her. For a moment, everything was silent except for a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Then the sounds came flooding back, screams and alarms, and the unmistakable crack of gunfire that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The camp's PA system crackled to life, and the voice of the base commander cut through the chaos with words that Claire would never forget. Mass casualties inbound. All medical personnel to triage bay. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Claire did not think. She ran. She burst out of the supply tent without grabbing a helmet, without grabbing a protective vest, without any of the safety equipment that the orientation briefings had insisted she wear whenever she left the main building. She ran toward the smoke that was rising from the convoy entrance, toward the sounds of screaming and gunfire and engines that were revving in panic. What she saw when she arrived would haunt her for the rest of her life. 3 military vehicles had been hit by an IED, a massive improvised explosive device that had torn through the convoy like the fist of an angry god. The trucks were shredded, their armored sides peppered with holes, their tires blown out their windows, nothing but jagged frames of broken glass. Soldiers were being dragged from the wreckage by their comrades, leaving trails of blood across the sand that the desert wind was already beginning to erase. But these were not regular soldiers. Claire had seen enough military personnel pass through the clinic to recognize the difference. These men wore no unit patches, no identifying insignia, nothing that would connect them to any official military operation. They were a ghost team special operations forces whose missions were classified so highly that they did not exist on any official record. And they were butchered. One soldier was holding his own intestines in place with one hand, while using the other to drag an unconscious teammate toward the medical tent. Another was screaming for a surgeon, his voice raw with desperation and pain. The sand around the convoy had turned a deep wet red, and the smell of blood and burning diesel filled Claire's nostrils until she thought she might vomit. Then she saw him. He was lying on a stretcher that 2 medics were carrying toward the triage area, a young man who looked like he could not be more than 20 years old. His throat had been torn open by shrapnel, and blood was bubbling up from the wound with every labored breath he tried to take. His chest was peppered with smaller wounds, and his left leg was twisted at an angle that suggested multiple fractures. He was drowning in his own blood, and his eyes, his terrified blue eyes, were looking up at Claire, as if she were the only thing in the world that could save him. That was the moment she met Ethan Cole. The operating tent was chaos barely contained by canvas walls. Dr. Harmon, the camp's chief medical officer, was standing in the corner with his hands hanging limp at his sides, his face completely blank. He was in shock. Claire realized his mind having simply shut down in the face of carnage that exceeded anything his civilian medical training had prepared him for. He was staring at a severed limb on the ground near the entrance, his eyes unfocused, his lips moving in some silent prayer or curse that would never be heard. Dr. Claire grabbed his shoulders and shook him hard enough to make his head snap back. "We need to operate. There are men dying out there." Dr. Harmon shook his head slowly, his eyes still not quite focusing on her face. "Too many." He whispered, his voice hollow and distant. "Too much damage. We cannot save them all. We do not have the supplies or the staff or the... We cannot." Claire looked past him to the stretcher where they had placed Ethan Cole. The young soldier's vital signs were crashing. his blood pressure dropping with every second that passed, his oxygen levels plummeting as his lungs filled with the blood that was supposed to be carrying life to his organs. He had maybe 3 minutes before his brain started dying from lack of oxygen. Maybe less. She thought about the rules. The rules were absolute, carved into the foundation of every nursing program in the country. A nurse does not perform surgery. Ever. Under any circumstances. A nurse assists, supports, monitors, but a nurse does not cut. Violating that rule meant automatic revocation of her license. It meant criminal charges. It could mean prison. She thought about her daughter Emma, just starting her freshman year at UCLA. Believing that her mother was doing heroic humanitarian work in a faraway country. She thought about Michael, her husband, waiting for her to come home safely, trusting that she would not take any unnecessary risks. She thought about her career, 20 years of training and experience and sacrifice that would be erased the moment she picked up a scalpel. Then she looked at Ethan Cole's face. He was somebody's son. Somewhere in America, there was a mother who had raised this boy, who had worried about him every day since he shipped out, who was probably sitting by her phone right now, praying for news that he was safe. That mother did not know that her son was dying in a tent 8,000 miles away, surrounded by strangers who were debating whether saving his life was worth the paperwork. Claire made her decision. She shoved Dr. Harmon aside with more force than she had ever used on another human being. "Get out of my way!" She growled, her voice carrying a command authority that she did not know she possessed. She turned to Thomas, the young orderly who was standing frozen near the oxygen tanks, his face pale with terror. "Prep the OR," she ordered. "I am scrubbing in." Thomas's eyes went wide. "You cannot," he stammered. "You are a nurse. You cannot perform surgery. It is against—" Claire was already moving toward the scrub station, already reaching for the surgical gown that was hanging on its hook. She looked back at Thomas, then at the dying soldier on the stretcher. "Watch me," she said. The inside of the operating tent smelled of iron and terror, and Claire Hartley had never been more afraid in her entire life. Her hands, the hands that had spent 20 years taking pulses and adjusting IV, drips, and performing the gentle, supportive tasks of nursing, were now holding a scalpel. The metal felt foreign in her grip, too light and too sharp, an instrument of precision violence that she had only ever watched others use. The surgical gown was too big for her, the gloves slightly loose on her fingers. Everything about this situation screaming that she was in over her head. But Ethan Cole was dying, and there was no one else. She made the first incision into the ruined tissue of his throat, and blood immediately welled up around the blade, obscuring her view of what lay beneath. Her stomach lurched, but she forced the nausea down and kept cutting, searching for the source of the bleeding that was drowning him from the inside. "Suction," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need suction now." Thomas the orderly was hyperventilating near the oxygen tanks, his hands shaking too badly to be useful. Claire wanted to scream at him, wanted to grab him and shake him, and demand that he pull himself together. But there was not time. Instead, she grabbed the suction tube herself, holding it in her left hand, while her right continued to navigate the bloody mess of Ethan's throat. There, she found it. The jugular vein had been nicked by a piece of shrapnel no bigger than her thumbnail, and blood was pumping out of the wound with every beat of his failing heart. She needed to clamp it, needed to stop the bleeding before he lost what little blood he had left. She dropped the suction tube and grabbed a hemostat from the instrument tray, her movements becoming surer as the old instincts took over. She had watched hundreds of surgeries over the course of her career, had handed instruments to doctors, and anticipated their needs before they spoke. She knew what needed to be done. She just had to trust herself to do it. The clamp closed around the damaged vein and the bleeding stopped. But before Claire could feel any relief, the cardiac monitor began to scream. The steady beeping that indicated a functioning heart had been replaced by a long, continuous tone that meant only one thing. Ethan Cole's heart had stopped beating. "He is coding," Thomas shrieked from somewhere behind her. "He is gone. Call time of death. We need to—" "No." The word came out of Claire like a weapon, sharp and absolute and brooking no argument. She dropped the surgical instruments and placed her hands on Ethan's chest, positioning them over his sternum, exactly as she had been trained during countless CPR certifications. She began compressions, putting her entire body weight behind each push, forcing his heart to pump blood through vessels that had forgotten how to work on their own. "Come on, soldier." She gritted out through clenched teeth. "You are not dying in a tent in the middle of nowhere. You have a mother somewhere. I know you have a mother. Do not you dare do this to her. She felt something crack beneath her hands, a rib giving way under the force of her compressions, but she did not stop. She could not stop. Epinephrine, she shouted. I need a push of epinephrine 1 milligram right now. Thomas was crying, his voice breaking as he rummaged through the crash cart. We are out. The supply truck was hit last week. We do not have any. Claire's eyes swept the room, searching desperately for something. Anything that could restart the heart that had stopped beating beneath her hands. Her gaze landed on a locked cabinet mounted on the wall, a metal box with a red cross painted on its front, and the words, Chief Medical Officer Only Emergency Supplies, stenciled beneath it. Without hesitation, Claire grabbed a heavy oxygen wrench from the counter next to her and swung it at the cabinet's lock. The glass shattered, spraying fragments across the floor, and Claire reached through the broken door to grab the vials of medication inside. Epinephrine, the good stuff, the concentrated emergency supply that was reserved for the most critical cases. She drew up the medication with hands that had stopped shaking, loaded it into a syringe and slammed it into Ethan Cole's IV port with a force that would have made her nursing instructors wince. Leave, she commanded, staring down into his open, unseeing blue eyes. Her voice was raw with desperation and fury, and something that felt almost like prayer. I order you to live. Do you hear me? I order you to live. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, there was nothing but the continuous tone of the flatline monitor and the distant sound of gunfire from outside the tent. Then beep. Claire waited, not daring to breathe. Beep, beep, beep. A rhythm, weak and thready, and barely there, but a rhythm nonetheless. Ethan Cole's heart was beating again. Claire slumped forward over the operating table, gasping for air, her entire body trembling with the release of tension that had been holding her upright. She had done it. She had brought him back from the dead. But outside the tent, the war was getting closer. The mortar round did not hit the operating tent directly, but it landed close enough that Claire felt the shockwave lift her body off the ground and slam her into the side of the surgical table. The lights died instantly, plunging the tent into a darkness so complete that Claire could not see her own hands in front of her face. The continuous beeping of the cardiac monitor was replaced by the emergency battery backup, a slower, more uncertain rhythm that matched the chaos unfolding around her. Outside, the sounds of battle had changed. The distant gunfire had become close gunfire, the crack of weapons being discharged just meters away from where Claire was lying on the ground. She could hear shouting in languages she did not understand, could hear the screams of wounded men and the barked commands of soldiers trying to organize a defense against an enemy that had breached their perimeter. The base was being overrun. Claire pulled herself up using the edge of the operating table, her head swimming from the impact of the blast. In the dim glow of the battery-powered monitor, she could see Ethan Cole still lying unconscious on the stretcher. His chest still partially open from the surgery she had been performing, his body completely vulnerable to whatever was about to come through that tent flap. Protocol was clear. She had sat through the orientation briefing just like every other aid worker. In the event of a base overrun, medical personnel were to evacuate immediately to the hardened bunker located beneath the main building. Patients who could not walk were to be left behind. It was a cold calculus, a mathematical equation that prioritized the survival of those who could be saved over those who were already lost. Claire looked at the bunker exit, a heavy door on the far side of the tent that led to an underground passage. She could make it. She could run right now and probably survive whatever was happening outside. Then she looked at Ethan Cole. He was unconscious, his chest still open, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that were running on battery power that would not last more than another hour. If she left him here, he would die. Not from his wounds, which she had managed to stabilize, but from whatever was coming through that door. The enemy fighters would not distinguish between a wounded American soldier and a medical target. They would kill him where he lay. Claire made her choice without conscious thought. She grabbed a Kevlar vest that a guard had left draped over a chair earlier that evening, a heavy piece of body armor that was designed for someone twice her size. She did not put it on her own body. Instead, she draped it carefully over Ethan's torso, covering his wounded chest with the protective material that might stop a bullet or absorb the force of an explosion. Then she climbed onto the gurney. She positioned her body over his, curling herself around him like a mother protecting a child from a storm. She covered his head with her arms, buried her face in the crook of his neck, and made herself as small as possible while still shielding as much of his body as she could reach. "Please, God," she whispered into the darkness, her voice shaking with terror. "Protect him. Take me if you have to. But please, please protect him. She could hear footsteps outside the tent, now heavy boots crunching on sand and debris. Shadows moved across the canvas walls backlit by fires burning somewhere in the compound. A flashlight beam swept across the tent, missing them by inches. The tent flap rustled. A silhouette appeared in the entrance, a man with a rifle raised to his shoulder, his face obscured by shadow. He shouted something in a language Claire did not understand and stepped forward into the tent. Claire squeezed her eyes shut. This is it, she thought. This is how I die. 2 suppressed gunshots rang out so quiet they sounded like whispers compared to the chaos outside. The silhouette in the doorway crumpled and fell. Clear left, clear right. American voices. English words. Claire's eyes flew open as 3 figures in night vision goggles stormed into the tent, their weapons sweeping the space with practiced efficiency. They moved like liquid shadow checking corners and securing the perimeter in seconds. The lead operator ripped off his goggles and looked down at the scene before him. He saw the destroyed equipment, the unconscious soldier on the stretcher, and the middle-aged volunteer nurse who had curled her body around that soldier like a human shield. His name was Sergeant Thomas Reed, and 20 years later he would be General Thomas Reed, shot twice in the chest and waiting for Claire Hartley to save his life one more time. Reed walked forward and holstered his weapon. He placed a hand on Claire's shoulder, his touch gentle despite the violence that surrounded them. "It is over, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that soldiers are not supposed to show. "You can let go now. We have got him." Claire was shaking too hard to respond. She could not seem to uncurl her body from around Ethan's, could not seem to release the protective position she had held while waiting to die. "Is he?" she managed to whisper. "Is he going to be okay?" Reed looked at the monitors, at the steady rhythm of beeps indicating a functioning heart, at the surgical work that Claire had performed under impossible conditions. He looked at the Kevlar vest she had placed over the soldier instead of wearing herself. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you brought him back from the dead. Then you used your own body as his armor." He keyed his radio with his free hand. "Command, this is Bravo 1. We have the package and we have a high-value civilian. I repeat, the White Witch is secure." The White Witch. Claire asked, finally managing to sit up. Her scrubs were soaked with blood and sweat, her hair had come loose from its bun, and she looked like she had crawled through hell itself. Reed grinned, though his eyes were wet with unshed tears. "That is you, ma'am. What you did in here, that was magic." They evacuated her by helicopter an hour later, after the enemy fighters had been pushed back and the base had been secured. She was reprimanded for the unauthorized surgery, stripped of her volunteer status for violating medical protocols, and sent home to Chicago within 48 hours. She never saw Ethan Cole again. She never knew if he survived the flight to the military hospital in Germany. She spent months checking obituaries, searching for any news of the young soldier whose heart she had restarted with her bare hands. She found nothing. Eventually, she convinced herself that he must have died, that her desperate measures had only delayed the inevitable, that the White Witch had failed. Until tonight. Claire opened her eyes to find herself back in the SUV, tears streaming down her face, her body still trembling from the memories that had consumed her. The rain was still hammering against the windows, and Chicago's skyline was sliding past in a blur of light and shadow. Ethan was watching her with an expression of profound understanding. He had seen the journey she had just taken, had recognized the 1,000-yard stare of someone reliving trauma that never fully heals. "I thought you died in Germany," Claire whispered, her voice hoarse. "I checked the obituaries for months. I searched every database I could access. There was nothing." Ethan nodded slowly. "I was in a coma for 6 weeks. By the time I woke up, you were gone. The military had scrubbed your name from every report connected to the mission, classified the whole thing so deep that even I could not access the files." He paused, and something painful crossed his face. "They did it to protect you from the legal fallout of performing surgery without a license. They saved you from prison, but they made it impossible for me to find you." He looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused from 2 decades of warfare, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer than Claire had ever heard it. "I spent 20 years fighting, Claire. Every mission, every firefight, every moment when I thought I was not going to make it home. I heard your voice. I order you to live." It became my mantra. The thing that kept me going when everything else had failed. Claire reached out and took his hand, this man, who had been a dying boy the last time she touched him. "I'm just glad you are okay, Ethan. But I need to understand what is happening. Why are you here? Where are we going?" The SUV was slowing down, approaching a heavy steel gate topped with razor wire. Armed guards in unmarked uniforms stepped out of a security booth, took one look at the vehicle's license plate, and immediately opened the gates without requesting identification. "This is O'Hare Airport's private military annex," Ethan explained as the vehicle rolled through. "We operate off-the-grid, handle problems that the government cannot officially acknowledge, but that is not why we came for you tonight." He turned to face her fully, and his expression shifted from the softness of reunion to the hardness of command. "The homeless man you saved at Mercy General. The one you got fired for." His name was not Henderson, it was Daniel Garrett, and he was one of our best deep cover operatives. Claire felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the SUV's interior. Garrett was carrying evidence of massive corruption. Ethan continued, "Billions of dollars being siphoned from the defense budget into a private military contractor called Aegis. We are talking about people at the highest levels of government, Claire. People who would kill to keep their secrets buried." "But he was dying," Claire said, struggling to connect the delirious homeless man to the world of international espionage. "He was going into septic shock." "He was poisoned," Ethan said grimly. "Aegis got to him before he could deliver the evidence. He knew he was dying, and he knew he only had one chance to complete his mission." He looked at Claire with something like reverence. "Garrett had been briefed about you. We had run backgrounds on every hospital in Chicago when we learned Aegis was operating in the area. Your file was flagged, redacted military service volunteer work in Afghanistan timeframe matching Operation Ghostlight. Garrett was instructed that if things went wrong, he should find the quiet nurse in trauma. Find the White Witch." Claire's hand moved unconsciously to her inner scrub pocket, the one she never used, and her fingers brushed against something small and hard that she had completely forgotten about in the chaos of the past few hours. "Check your pocket," Ethan said, watching her closely. "The inner one." Claire reached in and pulled out a micro SD card wrapped in a piece of bloody gauze. It was smaller than her thumbnail, lighter than a breath, and apparently worth more than she could comprehend. "Garrett slipped it to you when he grabbed your hand," Ethan explained. "He knew that if he gave it to anyone else in that hospital, it would disappear. He entrusted the evidence to the only person in that building he knew he could trust." Claire stared at the tiny chip in her palm. "So, Bradley Whitmore, my boss, Whitmore is on the Aegis payroll," Ethan said, and his voice carried a cold fury that made the other operators in the vehicle shift uncomfortably. "He has been feeding them information for years. When Aegis realized that Garrett had passed the evidence before he died, they needed to find out where it went. Whitmore manufactured the audit, engineered your termination, all to get you isolated and vulnerable. They were coming for you tonight," the operator called Bear spoke up from Claire's other side. "We intercepted their communications. Aegis contractors were scheduled to grab you at 0400 hours, take you to a black site and interrogate you until you gave up the location of the drive. We got there at 0350, Ethan said. 10 minutes made the difference between a rescue and a body bag." Claire sat back in her seat, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her like a physical force. She had not just been fired for caring too much. She had been targeted. She was a piece on a chessboard she had not known existed. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of a massive hangar, and through the windshield, Claire could see a matte black Gulfstream jet with no markings of any kind. Its engines were already spooling up, the high-pitched whine cutting through the sound of the rain. "We need you, Claire." Ethan's voice had shifted again from the warmth of their reunion to something more urgent and desperate. "Not just for the evidence. Not just because Aegis is hunting you. We need you because someone is dying, and you are the only person who can save him." "Ethan, I am 54 years old. My knees ache when it rains. I am not a soldier. I am not even a surgeon. I am just a nurse who got fired for caring too much about a homeless man." Ethan shook his head. "We do not need a soldier, Claire. We have plenty of trigger pullers. What we need is a healer who is not afraid to break the rules. Someone who values human life more than protocol and paperwork." He opened the door of the SUV, and the cold rain immediately began soaking through Claire's coat. She could see armed men moving around the hangar, could see the sleek black jet waiting on the tarmac like a predator ready to strike. The patient is General Thomas Reed, Ethan said, the sergeant who found us in that tent in Kandahar. He is the reason you were not court-martialed for practicing medicine without a license. He is the reason you got to go home to your family instead of spending years in military prison. Claire remembered the hand on her shoulder, the gentle voice telling her she could let go. What happened to him? 2 bullets to the chest. He was ambushed 3 hours ago, and he has been bleeding internally ever since. We have a full surgical suite on the plane, but our field medic was killed in the same attack, and the agency doctors want to stabilize and transport to a hospital. Then why do they not? Because if Reed goes to a regular hospital, he will be arrested. The same people who are hunting you have warrants out for his arrest. Fabricated charges, but enough to get him detained while they figure out how to make him disappear permanently. Ethan looked at her with the same desperate blue eyes that had looked up at her from a stretcher 20 years ago. Reed refused the agency doctors. He said there is only one person he trusts to cut him open, and that is the White Witch. Claire looked at the jet, its engines screaming against the storm. She looked at her tote bag containing the stethoscope her father had given her and the photograph of her daughter. She thought about her empty apartment, her canceled date, her destroyed career. She could walk away. She could ask them to drive her home to let her disappear into the anonymity of civilian life. She could find a job at a nursing home somewhere, spend her remaining years in quiet obscurity, and pretend that none of this had ever happened. Or she could step onto that plane. Claire reached into her tote bag and pulled out her stethoscope. She draped it around her neck, feeling the familiar weight settle against her chest like armor. Well, she said, and her voice was stronger than it had been all night. We should not keep the general waiting. Ethan's face split into a wolfish grin of pure triumph. Welcome to the team, ma'am. Claire had one foot on the jet's stairs when the night exploded into chaos. A black sedan screamed onto the tarmac from nowhere, its tires screeching against the wet concrete, its headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights hunting for escaped prisoners. Before the vehicle had even fully stopped, men in dark suits were pouring out of its doors, weapons drawn, and aimed directly at the plane. Federal agents, a voice screamed through a megaphone. Halt! Do not board that aircraft. But Claire could see Ethan's face in the glow of the hangar lights, and she knew immediately that these were not federal agents. His hand had moved to the pistol on his thigh, and his expression had shifted from reunion warmth to combat readiness in the space of a heartbeat. Aegis, he growled. They found us. Claire, get on the plane. Lock the door. What about you? I will buy you time. Go. The first shots rang out before Claire could argue, bullets sparking off the metal stairs inches from her feet. She scrambled upward, her old knees screaming in protest, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Behind her, Ethan and Bear had taken cover behind the SUV, returning fire with a precision that turned the approaching sedan into Swiss cheese. Glass shattered. Men dove for cover, the night filled with the thunder of weapons and the screams of people who had suddenly realized they were outmatched. Claire threw herself through the jet's hatch, landing hard on the carpeted floor of the cabin. Through the open door, she could see Ethan laying down suppressive fire, while Bear sprinted for the stairs. Commander. Now Bear bellowed as he hauled himself into the aircraft. Ethan fired 3 more rounds, then turned and ran. He hit the stairs at full sprint, bullets chewing up the tarmac behind him, and dove through the hatch just as Bear slammed the heavy door shut. The cabin pressurized with a thunk and a hiss that cut off the sounds of gunfire like someone had flipped a switch. Cockpit go! Ethan shouted into his radio. Get us in the air now! The jet lurched forward so violently that Claire was thrown against the cabin wall. The pilot was not bothering with clearance or taxi protocols. He simply slammed the throttles forward and pointed the aircraft down the runway at maximum acceleration. Through the windows, Claire could see muzzle flashes from the ground Aegis operatives shooting at the plane as it screamed past them. Then they were airborne, the G-forces pressing her into the seat as the pilot banked hard to avoid any pursuit. Are we hit? Claire gasped, struggling to catch her breath. Ethan was checking himself for bullet holes, his hands patting down his tactical vest with practiced efficiency. We are good. Everyone is good. He looked at Claire with something that might have been admiration. You okay, ma'am? Claire thought about everything that had happened in the past few hours. She had been fired, rescued, shot at, and was currently fleeing the country on a classified military aircraft. Her red dress was still pressed against her skin beneath her scrubs, a reminder of the date that felt like it had happened in another lifetime. Where is the general? She asked, pushing herself up from the floor. Where is Reed? Ethan pointed toward the back of the cabin. Medical bay. Through the curtain. Claire grabbed her tote bag, pulled out her stethoscope, and headed toward the rear of the aircraft. She had a life to save. The rear section of the jet had been completely transformed into a flying trauma center, and Claire felt a surge of professional appreciation, even as her heart clenched with fear at what she was about to do. Medical monitors lined the walls. IV stands swayed gently with the motion of the aircraft. A surgical table bolted firmly to the floor dominated the center of the space, and on that table lay General Thomas Reed, the man who had saved her life 20 years ago, looking like death had already begun to claim him. He was older than she remembered, his hair silver, where it had once been dark, his face lined with the weight of decades of command. But what struck Claire most was his color. He was gray, the particular waxy gray that she had seen too many times in her career, the color of a body that was running out of blood. 2 chest seals were plastered over wounds on his right side, but they were failing, dark blood seeping from beneath the adhesive and pooling on the sterile drape beneath him. A young man in a communications uniform was pressing a towel against the wounds, his face pale with terror. "Move," Claire commanded, and the young man jumped back as if she had struck him. She was at Reed's side in an instant, her hands already working, her mind shifting into the cold, clear space where emergency medicine lived. She checked the monitor's oxygen saturation at 82% and dropping blood pressure at 70/40, heart rate climbing, as his body fought desperately against the inevitable. He was crashing. Ethan, Claire shouted without looking up. "I need hands. Scrub up and get over here." Ethan appeared at her side, already stripping off his tactical vest. "Tell me what to do." "His right lung has collapsed," Claire said, her fingers probing the distended tissue around the wounds. "The pressure is building up inside his chest cavity, crushing his heart. If I do not relieve it in the next 60 seconds, he goes into cardiac arrest." She grabbed a large bore needle from the supply rack, her movement sure and precise, despite the gentle turbulence that made the floor shift beneath her feet. "Hold him steady," she ordered. She found the landmark, the space between the second and third ribs, and drove the needle into Reed's chest without hesitation. The hiss of escaping air was audible even over the jet engines. Blood sprayed across Claire's scrubs, but Reed gasped, his body arching as his collapsed lungs suddenly had room to expand again. "Saturation is climbing." Ethan reported, his eyes fixed on the monitor. 85, 88, 91. "He is not out of danger yet," Claire said, already reaching for the surgical tray. "One of those bullets nicked his subclavian artery. He is bleeding internally, and if I do not find it and clamp it, he is going to die." "Here," Ethan asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. At 30,000 feet, Claire looked at him, and in that moment she was not the invisible nurse who had been fired for caring too much. She was the White Witch, the woman who had brought him back from the dead in a tent in Kandahar. The woman who had used her own body as a shield against an enemy she could not defeat. "Unless you want to land and let Aegis finish what they started," she said, snapping on surgical gloves. "We do it here." She picked up the scalpel. "I saved your boys once, General," she whispered to Reed's unconscious face. "I am not letting you die on me now." She made the first incision. For the next 2 hours, the world outside the aircraft ceased to exist. There was only the 6-inch square of illuminated flesh in front of her, the steady beep of the cardiac monitor, and the voice in her head that refused to let another patient die on her watch. The plane shook with turbulence. The pilot banked to avoid radar detection. Ethan fed her instruments with hands that were steadier than most trained surgeons. Bear held a retractor with the grip of a man who had held weapons all his life, his massive fingers surprisingly gentle when gentleness was required. Claire worked with the focus she had not felt in 20 years. She found the damaged artery, clamped it, sutured it closed. She removed the deformed bullet that had lodged millimeters from Reed's heart. She repaired the lung tissue that had been shredded by the second round. Closing, she finally announced, her voice hoarse from 2 hours of concentration. She tied the final suture, placed the sterile dressing, and stepped back from the table. Her scrubs were soaked with Reed's blood. Her hands, steady as stone throughout the procedure, were beginning to tremble. She checked the monitor. Blood pressure 110/70. Oxygen saturation 98%. Heart rate 72, steady and strong. "He is stable," Claire breathed. She slumped against the cabin wall, her legs suddenly refusing to support her weight. Ethan caught her before she could fall and guided her into a seat. "You still got the magic witch," he said softly. Do not call me that, Claire replied. But she was smiling. General Thomas Reed opened his eyes to find an angel looking down at him. She was older than he remembered, her blonde hair streaked with gray, her face lined with the years that had passed since that night in Kandahar. But her eyes were the same, that fierce blue gaze that had stared down death itself and refused to blink. The White Witch. Reed rasped, his voice barely a whisper. 20 years and you are still saving soldiers. Claire took his hand, the same gesture she had made with countless dying patients, but this time there was a history between them that went deeper than medicine. Just returning the favor, General. You saved me too. Remember, you are the reason I got to go home to my family. Reed's eyes fluttered, the sedation still heavy in his system. The evidence. Garrett? The data. Safe, Claire assured him. It is over. A weak smile crossed the general's weathered face. My boys always said, if we ever needed a miracle, we needed you. He squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left, the same gesture that Daniel Garrett had made in the hospital. The same gesture that connected all of them across the years and the miles and the impossible circumstances that kept bringing them together. Reed closed his eyes and let the healing sleep take him. Claire sat back in her chair, still holding his hand, and watched the monitors cycle through their reassuring numbers. Outside the windows, the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the clouds with shades of gold and rose. She was not just a nurse anymore. She never had been, really. She was the White Witch, and she had finally come home. 3 months later, the Nevada desert sun was blazing down on a private airfield that did not appear on any map, and Claire Hartley was in the middle of an argument with a Navy SEAL about his blood pressure medication. I do not need pills. The young operator insisted, his massive arms crossed over his chest like a petulant child. Pills are for old people. Rodriguez, you are 32 years old with the cardiovascular profile of a stressed-out accountant. Claire replied, wielding her prescription pad like a weapon. You will take these pills every morning, or I will personally ensure that Commander Cole assigns you to latrine duty for the next 6 months. Rodriguez's eyes went wide with horror. You would not. Try me. He took the prescription. Claire walked through the facility that had become her new home, a sprawling complex of hangars and training areas and medical bays that housed some of the most dangerous people on Earth. She was not wearing scrubs anymore. Her tactical medical uniform fit her perfectly, and her blonde hair was tied back in a practical ponytail that kept it out of her way during emergencies. The stethoscope around her neck was the same one her father had given her all those years ago, but everything else about her life had changed. These men, these warriors who had seen the worst that humanity had to offer, called her mom without a trace of irony. They feared her more than they feared enemy combatants when it came to mandatory vaccinations and annual physicals. They told her their secrets, their fears, their hopes for futures they were not sure they would live to see. She had found her family. News had reached her 2 weeks after that night in Chicago. Bradley Whitmore had been arrested not for the corruption that had nearly gotten her killed, but for a sprawling web of financial crimes that the SD card had exposed. The evidence Claire had unknowingly carried had brought down not just Whitmore, but 17 other officials connected to the Aegis conspiracy. He was facing 20 years in federal prison, and Mercy General Hospital had issued a formal apology to Claire that she had never bothered to answer. Dr. Lisa Chen was the new head of trauma, and by all accounts, she was running the department with exactly the kind of compassion that Whitmore had tried to eliminate. Daniel Garrett, the operative who had started everything by pressing a tiny chip into Claire's palm, had survived his poisoning and sent her a thank you card with no return address and no signature, just 2 words. White Witch. Justice quiet and complete. The alert screen in the briefing room flashed red, and Claire felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had become as natural to her as breathing. Distress beacon, the communications officer announced. South America. Humanitarian aid convoy taken hostage by a cartel. 12 hostages, including 3 doctors. Local government refusing to intervene. General Reed, fully recovered and standing straighter than a man who had been shot twice, had any right to stand, studied the map on the wall. Ethan was already on his feet, sheathing the combat knife he had been sharpening. Spin up the bird, Ethan ordered. Wheels up in 10. He turned to Claire, and the question in his eyes was the same one he had asked her 100 times over the past 3 months. Ma'am, you coming? Claire grabbed her trauma kit, the custom medical bag that was worth more than her old car, and checked that her stethoscope was secure around her neck. "Try not to get shot this time, Ethan," she said, her eyes sparkling with the fierce joy of purpose. "I am running low on O negative. No promises," he grinned. As she walked toward the hangar, the desert sun caught the patch on her shoulder, a ghost rising from smoke, the symbol of a unit that did not officially exist. She thought about the red dress she had been wearing that night in Chicago, still hanging in the closet of her new quarters. She thought about the date that had never happened, the career that had ended the life she had lost. She had spent 22 years thinking her best days were behind her. She had believed that she was invisible, insignificant, a ghost haunting the halls of a hospital that did not appreciate her sacrifice. She had thought her compassion was her weakness, the flaw that would eventually destroy everything she had built. She was wrong. Claire stepped onto the ramp of the black jet, surrounded by the deadliest warriors on the planet, men who would kill for her and die for her without a moment's hesitation. The engines roared to life, screaming a challenge at the sky. She did not look back. There was work to do, lives to save. And for the first time in 20 years, Claire Hartley was exactly where she was supposed to be. And that is how Claire Hartley went from a fired, disgraced nurse to the most important member of the world's most elite secret unit. She thought her compassion was her weakness, but in the end, it was her greatest superpower, the one thing that commanded the respect of warriors who feared nothing else. Sometimes when you think your life is falling apart, when you lose your job and hit rock bottom, and feel like everything you have built has been taken away, it is actually the universe clearing the path for your true destiny. Claire refused to let a corrupt administrator define her worth. She held on to her integrity, her compassion, her belief that every human life is worth saving, and it led her to a family that would kill and die for her without question. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been in a situation where doing the right thing cost you everything? Have you ever stood up for someone who could not stand up for themselves even when you knew there would be consequences? Claire Hartley lost her job, her reputation, and nearly her life because she refused to let a stranger die alone. And because of that choice, she found something she never expected. She found a purpose bigger than herself. She found people who saw her not as invisible, but as irreplaceable. What about you? If a team of Navy SEALs showed up at your workplace tonight and asked you to leave everything behind for a dangerous mission into the unknown, would you get on the plane, or would you stay safe on the ground? Would you have the courage to step into the life you were always meant to live? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to hear your story. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the invisible heroes in your own life, please take a second to hit that like button. It really does help the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. And if you have not already, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another twist. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who is going through a hard time and needs to be reminded that their darkest moment might just be the beginning of something incredible. Remember, not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs, and some wear a red dress they never got to show off until the whole world bowed. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.